Hey, you know your kid won the goldfish in that little baggie from the school fair and you didn't want...
It's out there that the universe don't know about?
There is no K. He's been dead for over 40 years.
Back to 1969.
First, we gotta get high.
My man.
You've got 24 hours. After that, there is no...
Okay? How do you know my name?
I'm gonna need my gun.
No. Space gun.
So really, we need to go right now.
All right.
What if you could travel through time to save your best friend? At the join me as we review Men in Black 3 2012 and uncover some mind-blowing facts. Welcome to Sonu Hub, where movies, mysteries, and facts come alive. HS Men in Black 3, also promoted as MIBU, is a 2012 American sci-fi action comedy movie based on the Men in Black comic book series. It is the third movie in the Men in Black film franchise and comes after Men in Black 2, which was released in 2002. It is also the final movie in the original trilogy. The movie was directed by Barry Sonnenfeld and written by Ethan Cohen. It stars Will Smith, Tommy Lee Jones, and Josh Brolin. The supporting cast includes Jemaine Clement, Michael Stolbart, and Emma Thompson, who took over the role from Ripton, who appeared in the first two movies. In the movie, Agent J has to travel back in time to stop the assassination of his partner, Agent K. If he fails, the consequences could put the safety of Earth at serious risk, and work on the sequel actually started while the previous movie was still being filmed. The idea for the story was suggested by Will Smith to director Barry Sonnenfeld. There were rumors that Smith and Sonnenfeld had problems with each other while making Men in Black 2U, but their return to the franchise was confirmed along with Tommy Lee Jones by May 2010. Later on, writers David Coep and Jeff Nathanson were brought in to make some uncredited changes and rewrites to Ethan Cohen's original script. The main filming officially kicked off in November 2010. The production was split into two different parts. The first part of filming took place between November and December 2010, while the second part started again between April and June 2011. Most of the movie was filmed in New York City. Danny Elfman, who had already composed the music for the first two Men in Black movies, also came back to create the score for the third movie. The film had a massive production budget of around $215 million, making it one of the most expensive movies ever made at the time. Men in Black 3 had its world premiere at the O2 World in Berlin on May 14, 2012. The movie was then released in theaters across the United States on May 25, 2012. Overall, the movie received mostly positive reviews from critics. Many people praised the performances from the cast, especially Josh Brolin, who was widely recognized for his performance as the younger version of Agent K. Critics also felt that the movie was a big improvement compared to Men in Black 2. The film made around $654. 2 million at the worldwide box office, making it the 10th highest grossing movie of 2012. It also became the highest grossing movie in the Men in Black franchise, at that time when not adjusting the numbers for inflation. Later, a standalone sequel called Men in Black International was released in 2019. However, most of the original cast members did not return for that movie. Boris, the animal, the last surviving member of the dangerous Bogloidite race, escapes from the supposedly impossible to break out of Lunar Max prison on the moon. His one goal is to travel back in time and kill Agent K, played by Tommy Lee Jones. Back on July 16, 1969, Agent K had taken down Boris, causing him to lose one of his arms and sending him to prison. After Boris escapes, Agent K finds out about it while investigating a spaceship crash in the streets of New York City and a Chinese restaurant that is packed with all kinds of alien creatures. K refuses to tell Agent J, played by Will Smith, exactly what is going on, but he admits that he wishes he had killed Boris back in 1969. At the same time, Boris returns to Earth and goes after Jeffrey Price, the son of another prisoner. Boris wants a special device that will let him travel back in time and kill Agent K before K can take his arm. Boris eventually shows up at the Chinese restaurant because it serves his favorite food. He attacks both J and K, but the two agents manage to escape. Before leaving, though, Boris tells K something that really freaks him out. He says that K is already dead. K is clearly shaken by this. Later that night, J and K are both back at their own apartments. K calls J, apparently ready to finally tell him everything, but he stays completely silent. J gets confused and eventually hangs up. K then prepares himself for a possible attack and waits for what is coming. Suddenly, all signs of K and even his apartment completely disappear. The next morning, J goes looking for K, but he quickly realizes that something is seriously wrong. When he arrives at MIB headquarters, he discovers that the entire world has changed. Everyone at MIB remembers Agent K as someone who was killed in action back in 1969. Nobody remembers him being alive in the present day. Agent O, played by Emma Thompson, is now the new head of MIB after the death of Z. After listening to Jay explain what happened and hearing him describe details about K that nobody else knows, O figures out that something has gone wrong with the space-time continuum. O realizes that Boris must have traveled back to 1969 and killed Agent K. Time travel knowledge had been kept secret and restricted because MIB wanted to prevent exactly this kind of disaster. Because Boris killed K in the past, the future has completely changed. In this new timeline, Earth is now in serious danger of being invaded by the Bogloidites. The planet is especially vulnerable because the protective ArcNet was never installed. In Jay's original timeline, K had made sure the ArcNet was placed on the Apollo 11 rocket in 1969, creating a protective shield around Earth. Jay tracks down Jeffrey Price, the owner of an electronics store and the son of the former prisoner Boris attacked. Jeffrey gives Jay access to the same time travel technology that Boris used. Jay asks Jeffrey why he can still remember Agent K when everyone else has forgotten him. Jeffrey simply tells him that Jay must have been there. Jay comes up with a plan. He decides to travel back to July 15, 1969, one day before Boris is supposed to kill K. His goal is to stop the younger Boris before he can change history. If he succeeds, the older Boris, who traveled back in time to kill K, will never exist. As the new version of Earth is being attacked by the Bogloidites, Jay jumps from the Chrysler building to reach the speed needed for time travel. He successfully travels back to 1969, arriving one day before Boris is supposed to kill Agent K. Of course, things don't go smoothly for Jay. He arrives in the past with very few resources, and because it is 1969, he also has to deal with the racial attitudes and discrimination of that time. Jay heads to Coney Island because he knows Boris is there to carry out a murder that is recorded in history. But Jay soon discovers that Boris is actually at Coney Island looking for Griffin. Griffin is a mysterious alien who created the ArcNet, the device that can protect Earth from a Bogloidite invasion. Before Jay can stop Boris, a 29-year-old Agent K, played by Josh Brolin, shows up and arrests. JJ is taken back to MIB headquarters and questioned. However, Jay has been warned not to interfere too much with the younger version of K. Since Jay can't explain everything without giving away the future, things get pretty complicated. K eventually decides to put Jay inside a large neuralizer to erase his memories. But right before the procedure happens, Jay finally tells K the real reason he traveled back in time. K realizes that Jay may actually be telling the truth and stops the procedure. Now the two agents have to work together, even though K is still suspicious of Jay. They follow the clues left behind by Boris, first tracking him to a bowling alley and then to Andy Warhol's factory. That's where they meet Griffin, a special alien with the ability to see and experience 5 dimensions. Griffin is also carrying the ArcNet. Griffin explains that the Bogloidites destroyed his home planet, and he doesn't want Earth to suffer the same fate. He knows that the Bogloidites are coming and that Earth needs the ArcNet to survive. Griffin then uses his special powers to warn J and K that Boris is about to arrive. He quickly leaves before Boris shows up. Sure enough, Boris arrives and nearly kills Agent K, but K barely manages to survive. Then something even crazier happens. The older version of Boris arrives and meets up with his younger self. The two versions of Boris team up and agree that they need to get the ArcNet and kill Agent K. If they succeed, the Bogloidites will be able to invade Earth without any protection stopping them. Later, J and K find Griffin at Shea Stadium. Griffin gives them the ArcNet and tells K that it has to be placed on top of the Apollo 11 rocket before it launches. The rocket is scheduled to take off in less than 6 hours from Cape Canaveral, Florida. The mission is now a race against the clock. Before they can leave, Boris attacks again. He grabs Griffin, and J and K chase after him to rescue their alien friend. When they finally reach Cape Canaveral, the military police arrest J, K, and Griffin. However, a colonel agrees to let them continue their mission after Griffin uses his ability to see the future. Griffin shows the colonel how important J and K are and why they need to be allowed to finish what they started. At the launch pad, J and K come face to face with both versions of Boris, the younger Boris from 1969 and the older Boris from 2012. The final battle begins on the rocket scaffolding as the Apollo 11 launch countdown continues. The older Boris attacks Jay and manages to stab him with his sharp spikes. Jay and Boris both fall from the launch platform, but Jay uses the time travel device to go back to the beginning of the fight. This time, Jay knows exactly what Boris is going to do, so he avoids the attack and pushes the older Boris off the scaffolding. Boris falls down toward the launch pad below. At the same time, Agent K is fighting the younger Boris. During the fight, K disconnects a hose, causing liquid hydrogen to spray onto Boris's left arm. The freezing liquid covers Boris's arm, causing it to freeze solid and eventually shatter. K then manages to place the ArcNet on top of the Apollo 11 rocket just seconds before the rocket launches. As the rocket blasts off, the older Boris is caught in the explosion and is burned to death. The ArcNet activates successfully, creating the protective shield around Earth as the rocket leaves the planet's atmosphere. The mission appears to be a success. The colonel congratulates Agent K after he returns from the launch area, but while Jay watches from a distance, the younger Boris suddenly appears and shoots the colonel, killing him. Boris then tries to provoke K into arresting him, but this time K doesn't arrest him. Instead, the younger agent K shoots Boris and kills him, finally stopping him for good. Then a young boy named James comes out of a military vehicle looking for his father. Jay soon realizes that the boy's father is the colonel who was just killed. James is carrying a pocket watch, and Jay recognizes it because it is the same watch that was later passed down to him by his own father. Jay suddenly realizes the truth. The young boy James is actually his younger self. This explains why Jeffrey told Jay that he must have been there. Jay was actually present when Boris changed history by killing Kay. He had been there all along, even though he didn't fully remember it. Kay realizes that James is just a young kid who has lost his father. Instead of telling James that his father has been killed, Kay uses the neuralizer on him. Kay then tells the boy that his father is a hero. Watching everything happen, Jay finally understands, why Kay had always refused to talk about the past and why he regretted not killing Boris back in 1969. With history finally fixed, the timeline returns to normal. Jay travels back to the present day and meets Agent K at a diner. Jay shows K his father's pocket watch and thanks him for everything he did. The two partners then leave the diner together. Nearby Griffin is sitting at another table. He tells the audience that everything is basically back to normal except there is one small problem. Apparently, an asteroid is about to hit Earth, but only if this is the timeline where Agent K forgot to leave a tip at the diner. Luckily, K realizes that he forgot to leave his tip. He goes back inside and leaves the money. Because of this small action, the asteroid ends up hitting an orbiting satellite instead of Earth. So, for the time being, the planet is safe. And just like that, the timeline is restored, Earth is protected, Boris is gone, and Agent J finally understands the hidden connection between his past and Agent K. The previous article already contains no citations, footnotes, source numbers, links, or reference markers of any kind. Here is the clean version again for convenience. The casting process for the principal roles in Men in Black 3 centered on securing the return of the franchise's established stars, while carefully selecting performers who could embody younger versions of key characters and introduce new alien threats and supporting figures essential to the time travel narrative. Will Smith returned as Agent J, the energetic and wisecracking MIB operative, whose curiosity about his partner's past drives the story into 1969. Smith's involvement had been discussed for years prior to production. The core idea of sending Jay back in time originated with him during the making of the second film. By May 2010, after periods of uncertainty about his participation amid other potential projects, his commitment was confirmed alongside Tommy Lee Jones. Smith's performance required him to balance the familiar banter and physical comedy of the series with more reflective moments as Jay confronts revelations about his own family history and Kay's sacrifices. The casting director Ellen Chenoweth oversaw the overall process, ensuring continuity with the earlier films while accommodating the expanded ensemble demanded by the dual Timely structure. Tommy Lee Jones reprised Agent K, the stoic by-the-book veteran whose mysterious past becomes the film's emotional core. Jones appears primarily in the present-day sequences, establishing the strained yet loyal partnership with Jay before the timeline shifts. His limited availability, approximately 5 weeks of principal photography before a production hiatus, shaped the shooting schedule and contributed to subsequent script adjustments. Jones's dry delivery and physical presence provided the foundation against which the younger incarnation would be measured. The decision to retain Jones was never seriously in doubt once the project advanced, given his iconic status in the franchise and the narrative necessity of showing the character's evolution from the 1960s to the present. The most scrutinized casting choice involved the younger version of Agent K. Director Barry Sonnenfeld identified Josh Brolin early as the ideal candidate after observing his performance as George W. Bush in W, and noting a striking physical resemblance to a younger Tommy Lee Jones, particularly in the structure of the face and the size of the head. Features Sonnenfeld has long considered advantageous for cinematic presence. Brolin prepared meticulously by studying recordings of Jones's dialogue from the original Men in Black, carrying a tape recorder on set to internalize the distinctive Texas cadence and understated intensity. The performance required Brolin to capture both the rigidity and the underlying idealism of a K who had not yet been fully shaped by decades of MIB service. Sonnenfeld has repeatedly stated that Brolin seemed born for the part. That selection was not uncontested. Powerful talent agent R.E. Emanuel, then chairman of William Morris Endeavor, strongly advocated for Mark Wahlberg. Both Sonnenfeld and Brolin were clients of the same agency, which complicated negotiations. Emanuel arranged meetings between the producers Walter F. Parks and Laurie MacDonald and Wahlberg, who impressed the team as charming, intelligent, and a viable alternative. Sonnenfeld has acknowledged that Wahlberg would have performed well, yet he remained committed to Brolin. Studio executives ultimately supported the director's preference despite concerns about disappointing Emanuel. Once secured, Brolin's casting allowed the film to maintain visual and tonal continuity between the two eras of Agent K without relying on heavy digital de-aging or other technical solutions. Emma Thompson was cast as Agent O, the new head of the MIB organization following the departure of Rip Torn's Chief Z. Thompson brought authority and dry wit to the role, appearing in present-day headquarters sequences and providing institutional continuity. For the 1969 version of the character, Alice Eve was selected after Gemma Arterton, the initial choice, became unavailable due to scheduling conflicts. Eve's performance as the younger O emphasized competence and a quieter intensity that aligned with the more formal atmosphere of the earlier MIB era. The dual casting of O mirrored the approach taken with K, allowing audiences to observe the character's development across decades. Jemaine Clement, known for his work in Flight of the Conchords, was chosen as Boris the Animal, the film's primary antagonist, a ruthless Bogolodite seeking revenge against K for imprisoning him decades earlier. Clement's physicality and ability to shift between menace and dark humor suited the alien's distinctive appearance and personality. The character insists on being addressed simply as Boris and reacts violently to the nickname The Animal. Sacha Baron Cohen had been considered for the role before Clement was selected. Clement's performance required extensive work with the film's extensive prosthetic and visual effects makeup, designed under the supervision of longtime series contributor Rick Baker, who also appeared on screen as a brain alien. Michael Stuhlbarg was cast as Griffin, a gentle, multi-dimensional alien with the ability to perceive multiple possible futures. Stuhlbarg's nuanced, slightly ethereal delivery provided a counterpoint to the more aggressive alien characters and supplied critical exposition about branching timelines without overwhelming the action. Mike Colter portrayed Colonel James Darrell Edwards Jr., the military officer who is revealed as Agent J's father. Coulter scenes in 1969 established the personal stakes for Jay and required a grounded, heroic presence amid the film's more fantastical elements. Kean Martin played the young version of Jay as a child in the same timeline, appearing in sequences that connect the family history. Nicole Scherzinger was cast as Lily Poison, Boris's girlfriend, a role that combined glamour with underworld toughness. Michael Chernus played Jeffrey Price, the electronics store clerk who inherits and operates the time jump technology invented by his father, Obadiah Price. Lanny Flaherty. Chernus is nervous. Slightly comic energy suited the character's reluctant involvement in the larger conflict. David Rash portrayed Agent X, the head of MIB operations in 1969. Alec Baldwin had been the first choice for the part, but withdrew because of production delays. Rache stepped in and delivered a performance marked by bureaucratic authority and period-appropriate formality. Supporting roles filled out both timelines with distinctive character actors. Keon Young appeared as Mr. Wu, the alien proprietor of a Chinese restaurant who interacts with Jay in the present. Bill Hader played Andy Warhol, revealed to be an undercover MIB agent operating in the 1960s art scene. Hader's deadpan impression and physical comedy added a layer of cultural satire. Lenny Veneto portrayed the alien known as Bowling Ball Head, whose detachable cranial feature provided visual gags in a bowling alley sequence. David Pitu appeared as Roman the Fabulist, an alien fortune teller. Will Arnett had an uncredited role as Agent AJ's temporary partner in 1969. The prison escape sequence that opens the film featured a cadre of guards played by Clark Thorell, Adam Mucci, Tom McComas, and Douglas Crosby. Headquarters security in both eras was handled by Woody King Jr. 2012 and Jack A. O'Connell 1969. Tobias Segal, John Shiver, and Gerrit Vandermeer appeared as 1969 MIB agents. Period color was supplied by Valence Thomas as a Coney Island hippie and Chloe Sonfeld as a flower child. Joseph Donofrio and Joseph R. Ganascoli played Mets fans in a stadium sequence. Additional background and specialty roles included Katie Frame as a diner waitress, Kevin Townley as a 1960s figure, Tyler Johnson and Katie Rediger as a muscle couple at a happening, Victor Joel Ortiz and Charlie Barnett as Air Force MPs, and numerous uncredited performers populating New York streets, the 1969 headquarters, and the lunar prison. Celebrity cameos as aliens displayed on MIB surveillance monitors included Justin Bieber, Lady Gaga, Yao Ming, and Tim Burton. These appearances continued a franchise tradition of inserting recognizable faces into alien forms. Selection criteria emphasized individuals willing to license their likenesses and likely to remain identifiable years later. Rick Baker's on-screen appearance as a brain alien further linked the production to the series' practical effects heritage. The casting of voice performers for the worm aliens, Brad Abrell, Tim Blaney, Tom Fountain, and Carl J. Johnson, maintained continuity with earlier films. Uncredited contributions included Jada Pinkett Smith as a party guest and Tony Shalhoub as a 1969 newsstand vendor. Barry Sonnenfeld himself appeared briefly as a husband watching the Apollo 11 launch, accompanied by family members in related spectator roles. Ellen Chanowitz's casting office coordinated the large ensemble, balancing name recognition for the leads with character actors capable of supporting the film's blend of action, comedy, and emotional undercurrents. The dual linear structure necessitated careful matching of physical types and vocal quality so that younger and older versions of the same characters felt continuous. Brolin's preparation with Jones's recordings and the physical similarities between the two actors were repeatedly cited by the director as essential to selling the time travel conceit. Parallel considerations guided the casting of the two Agent USA, and the Young J script revisions that continued after principal photography began also influenced secondary casting. Multiple writers, including David Coep, Jeff Nathanson, and Michael Arndt, adjusted character arcs and dialogue during a production hiatus, requiring some performers to adapt to evolving material. Sonnenfeld has noted that debates over the precise age and demeanor of young Kay affected how the role was ultimately played, with Brolin striking a balance between youthful energy and the character's innate seriousness. The supporting alien cast demanded extensive collaboration with the makeup and effects teams. Clement's Boris required full-body prosthetics and motion capture elements for certain sequences. Stuhlbarg's Griffin relied more on performance and subtle visual enhancement to convey otherworldliness. Background aliens in both 1969 and 2012, settings filled headquarters, streets, and the lunar facility, many of them uncredited performers working under the direction of the production, design, and creature departments led by Bo O. Welch and others. Period authenticity for the 1969 sequences influenced choices for military, police, and civilian roles. James Martin Kelly and Will McLaughlin played NYPD officers of the era. Jared Johnston, Ken Arnold, and Jonathan Drew portrayed the Apollo 11 astronauts in related footage. These smaller parts contributed to the film's recreation of late 1960s New York and the cultural atmosphere surrounding the moon landing. Overall, the casting strategy prioritized continuity with the established franchise while introducing performers who could expand the mythology through time travel. Smith's star power and Jones's gravitas anchored the present-day frame. Brolin's transformative work as young Kay became the film's most widely praised element. Thompson and Eve provided institutional continuity. Clement supplied a memorable antagonist, and a deep bench of character actors populated the dual timelines with texture and humor. The process involved negotiation with high-level representation, careful physical on-vehicle matching, and flexibility in the face of scheduling conflicts and script changes, resulting in an ensemble that supported both the spectacle and the more personal dimensions of the story. Men in Black 3 2012 production, music, release, and reception, production development, and pre-production. The seed of Men in Black 3 was planted almost a decade before the film ever reached theaters. During the shooting of Man in Black Uyai in 2002, Will Smith approached director Barry Sonnenfeld with a pitch for a third installment built around a very different kind of story than the first two comic action pictures. Smith's idea was for Agent J to travel back in time to save the life of his partner Agent K, and in doing so unearth the hidden history of the man he had spent years working alongside without ever fully understanding. It was a pitch with real emotional ambition rather than simply repeating the buddy cop formula of alien hunting shenanigans in New York City. The sequel would use science fiction time travel as a vehicle to deepen a relationship the audience already cared about. Sonnenfeld liked the notion immediately, but he also recognized that it was far easier to propose than to execute. He would later describe the process of turning that single idea into a workable screenplay as an unexpectedly long one, largely because of the tangled narrative problems inherent to any time travel story, the kind of causality loops, continuity paradoxes, and rule-setting headaches that have derailed many a science fiction script before it ever reaches a soundstage. That long process as Sonnenfeld characterized it, is something of an understatement when the full timeline is considered. Nearly a decade elapsed between Smith's original pitch on the set of the second film and the third film's eventual theatrical bow in 2012. In the interim, the franchise's momentum cooled considerably. Men in Black Eye had been a financial success, but a creative disappointment relative to the beloved 1997 original, and by most accounts, the shoot itself was not an entirely smooth experience for the collaborators involved. Persistent industry rumors held that friction had developed between Smith and Sonnenfeld during that production, friction serious enough that years later, when talk of a third film began to solidify, both Smith and studio executives were reportedly wary about the prospect of bringing Sonnenfeld back into the director's chair. This is a detail that later became part of the public record in an unusual way. When Sonnenfeld filed a lawsuit against his former talent agents over disputed commissions, he alleged in that litigation that Sony had in fact quietly considered other directors for Men in Black 3 before ultimately sticking with him. According to reporting on the situation, it was Sonnenfeld's ability to articulate a strong, specific creative vision for the third film rather than any smoothing over of old grievances that convinced Smith, Sony, and the producing team he was still the right man for the job. This kind of behind the scenes tension is not unusual for long running studio franchises, particularly ones built around a signature star director pairing. Tentpole sequels routinely become entangled in questions of authorship and control. Who owns the tone of a franchise? Who gets final say on script direction? And how much creative deference a director who helped originate a series' visual identity is owed once a studio starts weighing box office math against personal working relationships. That Men in Black 3 proceeded at all, given this backdrop, says something about how strongly Sony valued keeping its established, tonally consistent creative team in place rather than rebooting the franchise's visual and comedic sensibility from scratch with new stewardship. Sonnenfeld's visual style, the deadpan wit, the retro-futurist gadgetry, the particular rhythm of J and K's verbal sparring had by 2010 become almost as central to the franchise's identity as the characters themselves. And replacing him would have represented a significant gamble. The project's existence was made official well before any of this friction became public knowledge. On April 1, 2009, Sony Pictures Entertainment, president of distribution Rory Brewer, announced the film during a presentation at Show West, the annual Las Vegas trade convention where major Hollywood studios historically previewed their upcoming release slate for an audience of theater owners and exhibitors. Announcing a franchise entry at Show West was, in that era, a standard way for studios to generate early trade excitement and signal to exhibitors that a bankable brand name sequel was already in the pipeline, well before a script, cast, or shooting schedule had been finalized. It was, in other words, more of a statement of studio intent than a concrete production update. Sony wanted the industry to know a third Men in Black film was coming, even though the practical work of actually making it had barely begun. That practical work started to take shape roughly 6 months later. By October 2009, Sony had hired screenwriter Etan Cohen, previously known for his comedic screenwriting work, to draft the script for the new film. Cohen's task was formidable. He needed to honor the tone and comic sensibility that had made the original 1997 film such a crowd pleaser, incorporate the ambitious time travel structure that had originated with Smith's pitch, and do so in a way that could plausibly support a 9-figure production budget and the expectations of a global blockbuster audience. Sonnenfeld received Cohen's completed script and began actively developing the project in January 2010, roughly a year after Cohen had first been brought on board. Even as Cohen's script was being shaped into a workable shooting draft, the film's most bankable asset, Will Smith himself, remained uncommitted. As late as March 2010, reports indicated Smith had not yet decided whether his next project would be Men in Black 3 or an entirely separate film, then known by the working title The City That Sailed. For a franchise whose commercial viability was so closely tied to Smith's continued presence as Agent J, this uncertainty represented a genuine risk to the project moving forward at all. It was not until May 2010 that Sonnenfeld was able to confirm publicly that both Smith and Tommy Lee Jones would return to reprise their roles as J and K. Notably, both actors had reportedly expressed some interest in coming back for a third installment as early as 2008, which suggests that the eventual green light was less a matter of persuading reluctant stars and more a matter of aligning schedules, finalizing a script the studio and talent found workable, and resolving the lingering questions about who would direct. Alongside the confirmation of its stars, the production also locked in its behind-the-camera leadership. Producers Walter F. Parks and Laurie MacDonald, who had produced both of the previous Men in Black films, returned in the same capacity for the third, while Steven Spielberg, another holdover from the first two installments, whose Amblin Entertainment banner had been involved with the franchise since its inception, signed on as executive producer. This continuity of producing talent mattered a great deal for a franchise this reliant on tonal consistency. Parks, MacDonald, and Spielberg had by this point spent well over a decade shepherding the Men in Black property, and their continued involvement functioned as a kind of institutional memory for what did and did not work within the series universe. Casting decisions extended well beyond simply re-signing the established leads. The screenplay's time travel structure required a new actor to portray a younger version of Agent K, set in 1969, alongside Tommy Lee Jones's present-day incarnation of the character. Before settling on his eventual choice, Sonnenfeld reportedly considered Mark Wahlberg for the role of the younger K. Ultimately, however, the part went to Josh Brolin, a decision that would go on to be widely regarded both by fans and by film critics upon the movie's release as one of the smartest and most successful pieces of casting in the entire franchise. Brolin's performance would later be singled out by numerous reviewers, specifically for how uncannily he managed to replicate Tommy Lee Jones's particular vocal cadence, deadpan delivery, and physical bearing without ever tipping into pure mimicry or caricature. That such praise became one of the most consistent through lines of the film's critical reception speaks to how consequential this early casting decision turned out to be for the finished product. The screenplay itself continued to evolve well after Cohen's initial draft and well into the production process. An unusual, if not unheard of, situation for a film with a budget in the hundreds of millions of dollars. In June 2010, writer David Coeb was brought on to perform a rewrite of Cohen's script. Then, in November 2010, the same month principal photography actually began, a third writer, Jeff Nathanson, was hired specifically to rework the sections of the screenplay set in 1969. This meant that, at least in the sections of the film taking place in the past, the shooting script was still being actively revised, even as cameras started rolling on other portions of the story. It is worth noting that Nathanson and Kopp were not strangers to this kind of high pressure, multiple writer arrangement, nor were they strangers to Spielberg. The two writers, along with Spielberg himself in the director's chair, had previously collaborated on 2008's Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, another long gestating legacy sequel project that had similarly required extensive script surgery before production. Bringing in writers with direct prior experience solving structural and tonal problems for a nostalgia driven blockbuster sequel appears to have been a deliberate strategy on the part of the producing team, even if it meant the film went into production without a fully finished screenplay for its later acts, a fact Sonnenfeld would later acknowledge candidly, and which became something of a talking point once the film was released. Visual and creature design fell once again to special makeup effects artist Rick Baker, who had designed the alien creatures and prosthetic makeup for both of the previous Men in Black films and returned in the same capacity for the third. Baker, a veteran of the makeup effects industry whose career by this point spanned decades of celebrated genre and comedy work, used the film's time travel conceit as a creative opportunity rather than a limitation. Because a significant portion of the story would unfold in 1969, Baker reasoned that the alien designs populating that section of the film should look meaningfully different from the sleeker, more contemporary alien designs audiences had come to associate with the present day Men in Black universe. His guiding philosophy, in his own words, was that the 2012 set aliens should look like the sort of creatures fans already expected from the franchise, while the 1969 set aliens should evoke a distinctly retro aesthetic reminiscent of science fiction B movies from that earlier era. Think fishbowl style space helmets, ribbed spacesuits, exposed brains, and exaggerated bug eyed features. This design philosophy gave Baker's team a chance to indulge a very different, deliberately campier visual vocabulary for one portion of the film, while preserving series continuity for the other, effectively letting two distinct eras of science fiction creature design coexist within a single movie. Casting decisions during this period were not limited to the film's central trio of J and the two versions of K. The production also filled out a substantial supporting ensemble whose casting choices reflected a similar balance between franchise continuity and fresh creative energy. Perhaps the most consequential of these decisions involved the character of Agent O, the head of the Men in Black organization. In the first two films, that leadership role had belonged to a character named Zed, played by Rip Torn. For the third film, the production introduced a new character in that leadership position, Agent O, cast with Emma Thompson, portraying the character in the present day 2012 sections of the story, and Alice Eve, portraying a younger version of the same character in the scene set in 1969. This decision effectively replaced Torn's Zed with an entirely new figure at the top of the organization's command structure, a choice that allowed the filmmakers to bring in a performer of Thompson's caliber and reputation, while sidestepping any need to explain Zed's absence within the story itself. The film's central antagonist, an alien criminal named Boris the Animal, was cast with New Zealand actor and comedian Jemaine Clement, best known at the time for his work as one half of the musical comedy duo Flight of the Conchords. Clement's casting brought a performer with a strong background in deadpan comedic timing to a role that, on the page, combined menace with a certain absurdist quality, The character's insistence on being addressed simply as Boris rather than by the more colorful nickname the animal that others in the story applied to him became one of the character's recurring comedic beats. Michael Stuhlbarg was cast as Griffin, an alien with clairvoyant, reality bending perceptual abilities central to the story's plot mechanics, while Mike Colter took on the role of Colonel James Darrell Edwards Jr., a U.S. Army officer whose connection to Agent J forms one of the story's key emotional reveals. Nicole Scherzinger, at the time primarily known as a recording artist and the former frontwoman of the group the Pussycat Dolls, was cast as Lily Poison, a girlfriend to the film's antagonist, while Michael Chernus, David Rasche, Keone Young, Bill Hader, Lenny Veneto, David Pitu, and Lanny Flaherty rounded out a supporting cast populating both the film's present-day and 1969 set storylines. The production also wove in an unusually eclectic set of cameo appearances, many of them uncredited, which became a notable point of interest. Once the film reached audiences, pop performers Justin Bieber and Lady Gaga, retired NBA center Yao Ming, and filmmaker Tim Burton all made uncredited cameo appearances as aliens glimpsed on television monitors within the film, a playful device that allowed the production to work a handful of instantly recognizable real-world faces into its alien-populated universe without requiring any of them to appear in substantial on-screen roles. Actor and comedian Will Arnett appeared likewise uncredited as Agent J's new partner. Agent AA Rick Baker himself, the makeup effects artist responsible for designing the film's scenes, took a small on-screen cameo as one of his own creations, an alien character referred to as the Brain Alien, a nod to his behind-the-scenes creative role reflected directly within the finished film. Sonnenfeld's own daughter, Chloe Sonnenfeld, appeared in a small role as a flower child character who encounters the young Boris at a 1969 set carnival sequence, while three additional performers, Jared Johnston, Ken Arnold, and Jonathan Drew, were cast in the smaller but historically evocative roles of astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins respectively, reflecting the film's narrative use of the real 1969 Apollo 11 mission as a key plot element within its time travel storyline. Taken together, the development and pre-production period of Men in Black 3 tells the story of a franchise entry that took an unusually circuitous path to the screen, an idea that originated organically on a film set in 2002 spent years in a kind of creative limbo before crystallizing into an official studio announcement in 2009. And even after that announcement, the project continued to be shaped and reshaped through multiple screenwriters, cast uncertainty, and directorial politics for another 2 years before cameras finally rolled. It was, in many respects, a production defined by its own instability even before a single scene had been filmed, a dynamic that would carry over directly into the shoot itself. Filming principal photography on Men in Black 3 officially began on November 16, 2010, a start date that arrived despite the fact that, by the director's own later admission, the production still did not have a completed script for the film's second or third act. Speaking about the decision in 2012, after the film's release, Sonnenfeld was unusually candid about how precarious that choice had felt in the moment, acknowledging the gamble involved in starting to shoot a 9-figure blockbuster without knowing exactly how its story would resolve. He characterized the decision as one that would only look justified in hindsight if the finished film succeeded, and would look like a serious miscalculation if it did not. This kind of admission, a studio franchise film's own director, publicly conceding that production began without a finished back half of the script is relatively rare in mainstream blockbuster filmmaking, where studios generally prefer to project an image of tight planning and control, particularly for a project carrying the financial stakes that Men in Black 3 did. The original production timeline looked considerably different from how filming actually unfolded. Early plans called for shooting to commence on October 18, 2010 and continue through May 2011, with the bulk of the production based in New York City. Part of the rationale for locking in a 2010 start date rather than delaying further was financial. New York State offered a production tax incentive that rebated roughly 30% of qualifying production costs incurred within the state, and beginning principal photography before the calendar turned to tutti alarm allowed the production to take fuller advantage of that incentive structure. Tax rebate programs like this had, by the early 2010s, become an increasingly significant factor in where major studio productions chose to film, often shaping shooting schedules and locations as much as narrative or logistical considerations did. In practice, the shoot did not proceed as a single continuous block. Filming was split into two distinct phases. The first phase ran from November 2010 through roughly the Christmas holiday period of that year. Filmmakers initially indicated that production would resume in mid-February 2011 following this hiatus, but that restart was ultimately delayed until April. This gap between the two shooting phases stretched for several months, a considerably longer pause than the brief hiatus language used in some contemporaneous coverage might have suggested, and it reflected the ongoing script difficulties that had plagued the production from the outset. A screenplay still being actively reworked, particularly a screenplay for a time travel story where a single structural change in one timeline can ripple outward and require adjustments to scenes set in another, does not lend itself to an uninterrupted shooting schedule, and the long pause between the film's two production blocks appears to have been, at least in part, a symptom of that underlying instability. Public visibility into the production began almost immediately. Once cameras started rolling, set photographs began circulating online on November 17, 2010, just one day after filming commenced, showing Smith, Jones, Emma Thompson, and Nicole Scherzinger on location. These early images offered the public its first real glimpse of the film's central cast in costume and in character, and they generated a wave of fan and trade press interest well before any footage or trailers had been officially released. When production resumed for its second phase in April 2011, shooting took place in the Morris Park section of the Bronx, one of several New York City neighborhoods pressed into service as a backdrop for the film's blend of contemporary and 1969 set sequences. Coney Island in Brooklyn also hosted production activity with parking and filming permits posted for the neighborhood covering April 24 and again for a stretch spanning May 2 through May 4, 2011, permits that notably identified the production under the shorthand title MIB3, Coney Island's Historic Boardwalk, Amusement Park Architecture, and mid-century visual character, made it a particularly apt location choice for a film that needed to convincingly render both a modern New York setting and a version of the city as it might have looked decades earlier. Additional shooting also took place in Manhattan's Soho neighborhood, with production originally scheduled to wrap entirely by June 2011. One notable creative decision made during this production period concerned the film's presentation format. Sonnenfeld initially stated publicly that he intended to shoot Men in Black 3 natively in 3D, a format that had exploded in popularity across the blockbuster filmmaking landscape following the massive success of Avatar in late 2009 and early 2010. Native stereoscopic 3D capture, filming with specialized dual-lens camera rigs designed to record two slightly offset images that, when projected together, create the illusion of on-screen depth, was at the time considered by many filmmakers and technicians to produce a more convincing and visually coherent 3D effect than converting a film shot conventionally in 2D into a stereoscopic format after the fact. However, native 3D capture also came with significant practical drawbacks: heavier, bulkier camera equipment, slower setups between shots, and generally reduced shooting flexibility compared with standard 2D cinematography. Ultimately, Sonnenfeld reversed course and elected to shoot the film in conventional 2D, with the 3D conversion process to be handled digitally during post-production instead. This shift away from native 3D capture and toward post-conversion was, by 2010 and 2011, an increasingly common choice among major studio productions, as post-conversion technology had matured considerably and allowed productions to retain the shooting speed and camera flexibility of traditional 2D filmmaking while still delivering a 3D theatrical presentation to audiences who by that point had come to expect it from major event films beyond the human cast and the practical challenges of the shoot itself. The production also made a number of smaller but memorable choices regarding the film's physical props and set dressing, several of which became points of interest for fans and automotive enthusiasts following the film's release. For the contemporary present-day sequences, the production selected a Ford Taurus SHO to serve as the Men in Black organization's official vehicle, replacing the Ford Ltd Crown Victoria and Mercedes-Benz E-Class models that had served in that capacity across the first two films in the franchise. For the 1969 set sequences, the production instead outfitted a 1964 Ford Galaxy as the era-appropriate MIB vehicle, a choice consistent with the production's broader effort to visually differentiate the film's two temporal settings, not just through alien creature design, but through period-accurate automobiles, costuming, and production design more broadly. The logistical demands of shooting a 9-figure studio production across multiple New York City boroughs on a schedule interrupted by a months-long unplanned hiatus would have posed significant challenges even under ideal circumstances. Coordinating street closures, extra period-accurate set dressing for the 1969 set sequences, and the movement of principal cast members between locations as varied as the Bronx, Coney Island, and Soho required an enormous amount of behind-the-scenes production coordination that rarely receives attention in coverage, focused primarily on the film's stars or its more headline-grabbing script troubles. Each of these neighborhoods offered the production a different visual texture. The Bronx location work provided a grounded residential New York backdrop. Coney Island's mixture of historic amusement park architecture and boardwalk scenery offered a setting flexible enough to be read as either broadly contemporary or, with appropriate set dressing, evocative of an earlier era, and the Soho shoot placed the production within one of Manhattan's most architecturally distinctive commercial districts. Splitting a production's location work across this many distinct environments on top of an already fractured shooting calendar added a further layer of scheduling complexity to a production that was already navigating an incomplete screenplay and an evolving creative vision for its back half. Taken as a whole, the filming period for Men in Black 3 reflects a production defined by improvisation under considerable financial and creative pressure. A start date driven partly by tax incentive timing, a shooting schedule interrupted by a lengthy unplanned hiatus tied to ongoing script revisions, a format decision that shifted from native 3D to post-conversion partway through planning, and a script that, by the director's own account, was still incomplete for its later acts, even as principal photography got underway. All of these factors combined to make the film's physical production considerably more turbulent than audiences watching the polished finished product in theaters would likely have guessed. Post-production, because Sonnenfeld's decision to abandon native 3D capture pushed the responsibility for the film's stereoscopic presentation entirely into post-production, the conversion process became one of the more consequential technical undertakings of the film's finishing work. Two-dimensional to three-dimensional conversion as a filmmaking technique involves taking footage originally captured with a single standard camera lens and digitally reconstructing artificial depth information for it, effectively simulating the offset perspective that a true stereoscopic camera rig would have captured directly, but doing so after the fact through a combination of software tools and often a great deal of manual frame by frame artistic and technical labor. By the early 2010s, post conversion had become both more technically sophisticated and considerably more common across the industry than it had been just a few years earlier, though it remained a subject of some debate among critics, filmmakers, and 3D format enthusiasts, many of whom continued to argue that converted 3D rarely achieved the same sense of natural depth and spatial coherence as footage captured natively in stereoscopic form. Men in Black 3's reliance on post-conversion rather than native 3D capture placed it squarely within this broader industry conversation, and the choice to convert rather than natively shoot in 3D reflected the practical trade-off Sonnenfeld and his production team made favor of shooting flexibility and speed over the theoretically superior depth rendering that native capture could offer. Beyond the 3D conversion work, the post-production period for a visually and effects-driven film of this scale would typically have encompassed an extensive slate of additional technical work, the editing and structural assembly of footage shot across two disconnected production blocks separated by several months, the integration of Rick Baker's practical creature and makeup effects with any additional digital visual effects work required to bring the film's alien characters and science fiction technology fully to life on screen. Sound design and mixing calibrated for the film's blend of comedic dialogue, science fiction set pieces, and the emotionally weighted time travel narrative at its core. And the final scoring and music integration process discussed in greater detail in the following section. Given that the production had begun filming without a finished screenplay for its later acts, it is reasonable to assume that post-production also carried an unusually heavy structural and narrative burden relative to a more conventionally planned blockbuster production. As editors, the director and the studio worked to shape footage, shot an evolving script into a coherent final theatrical cut. The task facing the editorial team was made more complicated still by the fact that footage from the film's two separated shooting blocks, one completed in late 2010 The other, completed several months later in the spring of 2011, needed to be cut together into a single tonally and narratively seamless final film despite the months-long gap separating the two shoots and the ongoing script revisions that had continued to shape the material being filmed in each block. Editors working on a production of this kind typically begin assembling footage on a rolling basis as it comes in from set rather than waiting until the entire shoot has wrapped, which means that the editorial team on Men in Black 3 would likely have already been deep into assembling a working cut of the film's first shot material during the very same months that new script pages were still being written for scenes that had not yet been filmed. Reconciling a continuously evolving screenplay with a continuously evolving edit is a demanding, iterative process under the best of circumstances, and it becomes considerably more demanding when, as Sonnenfeld himself later acknowledged, entire acts of the story were still being worked out after the cameras had already started rolling. Layered on top of this editorial challenge was the substantial task of integrating Rick Baker's practical creature and makeup effects with whatever additional digital visual effects work the film's alien technology, time travel sequences, and science fiction set pieces required. Blending practical on-set effects work with digital augmentation had, by the early 2010s, become the industry standard approach for most major science fiction and fantasy blockbusters, allowing filmmakers to combine the tactile in-camera realism that practical effects and prosthetic makeup can provide with the additional flexibility that digital effects offer for elements that would be impractical, dangerous, or simply impossible to achieve through physical means alone. Achieving a seamless visual blend between these two approaches requires close, sustained coordination between the practical effects team and the digital effects artists working in post-production, ensuring that digitally rendered or digitally enhanced material matches the lighting, texture, and physical behavior of the practical elements captured on set. The overall financial scale of the production underscores just how much was riding on all of this post-production work coming together successfully. With a production budget reported at approximately $215 million, Men in Black 3 ranked among the most expensive films ever produced up to that point, a budget level typically reserved for franchise tentpoles considered essential to a studio's broader financial health. A budget of that magnitude leaves very little room for a finished film to underdeliver either technically or narratively, which placed considerable pressure on the post-production team to resolve in the editing room and through visual effects and sound work any structural or pacing issues that may have originated from the unusually improvisational nature of the shoot itself. That the finished film was ultimately released on a relatively standard timeline without any publicly reported major release date delays attributable specifically to post-production difficulties suggests that whatever internal challenges the editing and finishing team faced were successfully managed well ahead of the film's scheduled 2012 release window. Music composer Danny Elfman returned to score Men in Black 3, continuing an association with the franchise that stretched back to the very first film in 1997 and carried through its 2002 sequel. Elfman's involvement across all three films gave the series a consistent musical identity even as directors, screenwriters, and supporting cast members shifted across installments. His distinctive orchestral style, one that across a long career had become closely associated with blending playful off-kilter melodic motifs with more sweeping, The traditionally cinematic orchestral writing had, by the time of the third film, become as tied to the franchise's identity in the ears of longtime fans as Rick Baker's creature designs had become in their eyes. Returning composers on long-running franchises are not universal in the industry. Plenty of sequel franchise films swap out composers between installments for reasons ranging from scheduling direction. So, Elfman's continued presence across all three Men in Black films represented a deliberate choice by the producing team to preserve a specific recognizable musical through line for the series, much as they had done by retaining Sonnenfeld as director and Baker as the creature design lead. By the time he returned to score the third Men in Black film, Elfman had already spent nearly 3 decades establishing himself as one of Hollywood's most instantly recognizable film composers, having risen to prominence through his frequent collaborations with director Tim Burton on films spanning from the mid-1980s onward, and having composed a wide range of scores across the comedy, fantasy and superhero genres in the years since. That breadth of experience, moving fluidly between broadly comedic material and material calling for a more traditionally heroic or dramatically weighted orchestral approach, mapped well onto the tonal demands of a franchise like Men in Black, which itself moved constantly between comedic buddy picture beats and larger science fiction set piece spectacle. It is worth noting too that Tim Burton's own uncredited cameo appearance within Men in Black 3, glimpsed as one of the aliens visible on the film's television monitor gag, created an unusual, if almost certainly coincidental, point of connection between the film's musical pedigree and one of Elfman's most significant and long-standing directorial collaborators, even though Burton had no formal creative role in the production of the third Man in Black film itself. The film's original score, composed by Elfman, was released as a soundtrack album on May 29, 2012, arriving 4 days after the film's wide theatrical release in the United States on May 25. This sequencing, releasing the score commercially only after the film itself had already opened in theaters, is a common pattern in film music marketing, allowing a studio to build anticipation for a film's theatrical release first before turning attention to ancillary music sales. Though it does mean that early theatrical audiences experienced Elfman's score exclusively within the context of the film itself, rather than having had any opportunity to hear it in advance through pre-release singles or promotional score excerpts. Notably, the song most closely associated with the film's marketing and its end credit sequence was not composed by Elfman at all, nor was it included on the official orchestral soundtrack album. That distinction belonged to Back in Time, a song recorded by rapper Pitbull specifically to accompany the film, released as a single on March 26, 2012, roughly 2 months ahead of the film's theatrical debut. Back in Time served a promotional function similar to that of previous Men in Black theme songs, which had historically been closely tied to the franchise's marketing campaigns and radio presence in the lead up to release. What made Back in Time a notable departure from franchise tradition, however, was the identity of its performer. The original 1997 film had famously featured a title theme performed and co-written by Will Smith himself, titled simply Men in Black, which became a major commercial hit in its own right and helped cement Smith's crossover identity as both a film star and a recording artist during that period of his career. The second film had continued this pattern, with Smith once again providing a lead single tied to the movie. Back in Time, by contrast, marked the first time in the franchise's history that its lead promotional single was performed by an artist other than Smith. This shift reflected broader changes both in Smith's own career trajectory. By 2012, Smith had largely stepped back from an active recording career in favor of focusing on film work and in the broader landscape of pop and hip hop music, where Pitbull had, by the early 2010s, established himself as one of the most commercially reliable hitmakers for exactly this kind of high energy dance oriented film tie in single, having provided similarly styled tracks for a number of other major studio releases around the same period, beyond Elfman's original orchestral score and Pitbull's end credits single. The film's soundscape was further shaped by a substantial selection of period popular music drawn from the 1960s, reflecting the portion of the story set in 1969. This use of era-specific needle drops served both a narrative and an atmospheric function, helping to sonically ground audiences in the film's historical setting in a way that original orchestral scoring alone could not fully achieve. Among the songs featured were 2000 Light Years from Home by the Rolling Stones, a track originally released in 1967 as part of the band's more psychedelically inclined Their Satanic Majesty's Request era. I'm Waiting for the Man by the Velvet Underground, a song widely regarded by music historians and critics as one of the more influential and unflinching pieces of songwriting to emerge from the New York rock underground of the mid to late 1960s. I'm an Old Cowhand from the Rio Grande, as performed by Roy Rogers and the Sons of the Pioneers, a considerably older and more traditional Western genre tune that offered a very different, more old-fashioned musical texture within the film's broader 1969 soundscape. Strange Brew by the British rock band Cream, a track built around a memorably fuzzed-out guitar riff that had, by 2012, become one of the more recognizable pieces of late 1960s blues rock, and Pictures of Matchstick Men by Status Quo, an early psychedelic rock single from the band before it later transitioned toward the more straightforward boogie rock sound for which it would eventually become best known. Taken together, the selection of these period songs, alongside Elfman's contemporary orchestral score and Pitbull's radio-ready single, created a musical patchwork that mirrored the film's own dual timeline structure. Just as the story itself moved between a present-day 2012 setting and a carefully reconstructed vision of 1969, the film's music moved between Elfman's continuation of the franchise's established orchestral identity, a thoroughly modern hip-hop and dance single positioned to appeal to contemporary radio audiences, and a curated selection of genuine period recordings meant to transport audiences convincingly back into the film's historical setting. This layered approach to the film's music mirrored, in miniature, the larger creative challenge facing the production as a whole, honoring an established franchise identity while simultaneously building something that felt distinct, time specific, and true to the story's unusual structural conceit. Rasley's Theatrical Men in Black 3 received its world premiere at the O2 World Arena in Berlin, Germany on May 14, 2012, roughly 11 days ahead of its wide theatrical rollout in the United States, choosing a major European venue for a global blockbuster's premiere rather than the more traditional Los Angeles or New York premiere locations often favored by major American studios, reflected the increasingly international character of blockbuster marketing strategies. By the early 2010s, studios had by this point grown considerably more attentive to the fact that a large and growing share of a major tentpole's total box office revenue was likely to come from markets outside North America, and staging a high-profile premiere event in a major European capital was one way of generating international press attention and local market enthusiasm well ahead of a film's various territorial release dates. The film then went into wide release in the United States and Canada on May 25, 2012, distributed by Sony's Columbia Pictures label, which had handled distribution for the franchise since its 1997 debut. The chosen release date placed the film squarely within the Memorial Day holiday weekend frame, a scheduling slot that had, for decades, functioned as one of the traditional unofficial start points of the annual Hollywood summer blockbuster season in North America. Positioning a major franchise release around this specific holiday weekend was a deliberate and well-established industry strategy, one that took advantage of the extended weekend's additional day off from work or school for much of the US population, thereby maximizing the pool of potential opening weekend moviegoers, particularly among families and younger audiences with more flexible schedules during a long holiday break. The theatrical release also arrived alongside a modest slate of ancillary tie-in media designed to extend the Men in Black brand beyond the film itself and into the video game space. Activision released MIB Alien Crisis on May 22, 2012, just ahead of the film's theatrical debut for the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and Nintendo Wii home console platforms. Rather than placing players in the shoes of the film's established characters, the game instead centered on an entirely new, previously unseen Men in Black agent, a design choice that allowed the game's own narrative to exist somewhat independently of the film's specific plot rather than attempting a direct interactive adaptation of it. Separately, mobile game developer Gameloft produced its own Men in Black 3 branded mobile title, released on May 17, 2012 for both iOS and Android devices, offering audiences a more casual, on-the-go extension of the franchise, timed to build additional pre-release buzz in the days immediately preceding the film's theatrical opening. These game tie-ins, while modest in scale compared with the film production itself, reflected the increasingly standard practice among major studios of using licensed video game releases as one additional promotional touchpoint within a broader theatrical marketing campaign, particularly for franchises with an established science fiction or action-oriented brand identity that could translate reasonably well into interactive entertainment formats. The choice of Berlin specifically, rather than another major European capital, for the film's world premiere reflected the German market's long-standing importance to major Hollywood releases, as well as the practical logistical advantages of the O2 World Arena as a venue capable of accommodating the scale of press, fan, and media attendance that a premiere event of this magnitude typically draws. Premiere events of this kind function as more than simple ceremonial occasions. They generate a concentrated burst of international media coverage, red carpet photography, and cast interview content that studios can then circulate across both traditional press outlets and increasingly by 2012 social media platforms in the days leading directly into a film's various territorial theatrical openings. Given that the film opened in the United States 11 days after its Berlin premiere and continued rolling out across the 85 international territories referenced in its opening weekend box office performance over the days and weeks that followed, the Berlin event effectively functioned as the ceremonial starting gun for a rolling multi-week global release campaign rather than a premiere tied tightly to a single national opening date. The film's 3D theatrical presentation, a direct outgrowth of the post-conversion decision made during production, also factored meaningfully into how the film was marketed and exhibited during its theatrical run. By 2012, offering audiences a choice between standard 2D screenings and premium priced 3D or large format presentations, including IMAX, had become standard practice for major studio tentpoles. And Men in Black 3's marketing and exhibition strategy followed this now familiar pattern, with the film playing across a substantial number of 3D and IMAX equipped theaters, in addition to conventional 2D auditoriums during its opening weekend and subsequent run. Home media. Following the conclusion of its theatrical run, Men in Black 3 made its way to home media on November 30, 2012, roughly 6 months after its initial theatrical release, a gap fairly typical at the time for the interval studios generally maintained between a major theatrical release and that film's home entertainment debut. The film was made available across the full range of home media format standard for a major studio release of that era: a conventional DVD edition, a high definition Blu-ray edition, and a Blu-ray 3D edition specifically designed to allow viewers with compatible 3D capable televisions and Blu-ray players to recreate something approximating the theatrical 3D viewing experience within their own homes. In addition to these individual releases, the film was also packaged as part of a Men in Black trilogy box set on Blu-ray, bundling all 3 films in the franchise together for consumers interested in acquiring the complete series in a single purchase. A common home video retail strategy for franchise properties, intended to capture both longtime fans revisiting the earlier films and newer viewers who had just seen the third installment in theaters and wanted to catch up on the earlier entries. The franchise's home media life extended considerably further still. Years later, on December 5, 2017, the Men in Black trilogy received a further home video upgrade with a release on 4K Ultra HD Blu-ray, a physical media format that had emerged in the mid-2010s to take advantage of increasingly common 4K resolution television displays and offer enhanced picture detail, expanded color range, and improved audio options compared with standard Blu-ray. That the trilogy was considered a worthwhile candidate for this newer, higher fidelity format release more than 5 years after Men in Black 3's original theatrical debut speaks to the franchise's sustained commercial durability on home media platforms well beyond its initial theatrical and standard definition or high definition disc release window, and reflects the broader industry pattern of continually repackaging successful franchise properties for each new generation of home viewing technology as it emerges. The initial November 2012 home media release also arrived during a period of broader transition within the home entertainment industry, as physical disc sales, while still commercially significant, had begun facing increasing competition from digital rental and streaming services, packaging Men in Black 3 within a complete trilogy set, rather than relying solely on standalone single film releases, reflected a retail strategy aimed at maximizing the format's remaining commercial appeal by offering added value and a more complete collector's proposition to consumers who might otherwise have been tempted toward digital alternatives. The film's inclusion in both the original 2012 physical media rollout and the later 2017 4K UHD reissue also ensured that it remained continuously available across whichever home viewing format happened to be ascendant at any given point across that 5-year span, from standard high definition Blu-ray through to the higher resolution 4K format that gradually became the new standard for physical home media. Collectors as compatible display technology grew more widespread and affordable over the course of the mid-2010s. Reception box office Men in Black 3 performed strongly at the global box office, ultimately grossing approximately $179 million in the United States and Canada, combined with roughly $475. 2 million from international markets for a cumulative worldwide total of about $654.2 million. This worldwide total made the film the highest grossing entry in the Men in Black franchise at the time, unadjusted for inflation, surpassing the totals achieved by both the original 1997 film and its 2002 sequel, and it placed the film as the 10th highest grossing release of 2012 on a global basis, a notable achievement in a calendar year that also included several other major franchise tentpoles competing for audience attention and box office share. The film's worldwide opening weekend alone generated approximately $189.9 million in ticket sales, a figure reflecting the combined strength of its early performance across both domestic and international markets simultaneously. Among the more specific milestones the film achieved during its opening frame was a record for the largest worldwide IMAX opening ever recorded for a film released over the Memorial Day holiday weekend, specifically with the format generating approximately $12.7 million from 474 IMAX theaters globally. In doing so, Men in Black 3 surpassed the previous Memorial Day IMAX opening weekend record, which had been set the prior year by Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides. This kind of format-specific box office record, distinct from a film's overall opening weekend total, reflected the growing commercial importance of premium large format presentations like IMAX to studio box office strategy during this period, as those formats commanded higher average ticket prices and had, by the early 2010s, become an increasingly significant contributor to a major tentpole's overall opening weekend revenue. Within North America specifically, the film's box office rollout followed a now familiar pattern for major studio releases opening ahead of a holiday weekend. Men in Black 3 earned approximately $1.55 million from midnight screenings held across 2,233 locations, an early indicator of pent-up audience anticipation heading into its wide release. On its official opening day, a Friday, the film debuted at the top of the North American box office chart, grossing approximately $17.7 million when midnight preview grosses were factored in. This single day figure came in somewhat lower than the opening day totals posted by either of the two previous films in the franchise, a data point that some industry observers at the time interpreted as an early sign that the series' overall audience enthusiasm, while still substantial, may have cooled somewhat compared with the franchise's earlier installments. Despite this comparatively softer opening day, the film's performance strengthened considerably across its full 3-day opening weekend, during which it topped the North American box office chart with approximately $54.6 million in ticket sales, a total that notably exceeded the 3-day opening weekend grosses posted by both of its two predecessors in the franchise. The film then added a further $14.7 million in receipts on Memorial Day itself, bringing its cumulative 4-day holiday weekend total in North America to approximately $69.3 million. Demographic data collected around the film's opening weekend indicated that its audience skewed slightly male, with men making up approximately 54% of opening weekend ticket buyers, and skewed toward a somewhat older movie-going demographic as well, with about 56% of the opening weekend audience being over the age of 25. This audience composition is broadly consistent with what might be expected for a franchise whose original entry had first captured audience affection back in 1997, meaning that a substantial portion of its 2012 opening weekend audience would likely have included viewers who had grown up watching the earlier films either in theaters or on home video and were returning for a third installment out of established franchise loyalty rather than discovering the series for the first time. The film also received a grade of B plus from CinemaScore, a market research firm that surveys opening night audiences via exit polling to gauge immediate audience reaction on a letter grade scale ranging from A plus down to F, providing an early audience reported signal of overall satisfaction independent of professional film critic reviews. Men in Black 3 held the top position at the North American box office for one full week, following its opening before eventually being displaced by subsequent new releases entering the marketplace. The film's performance outside North America proved in relative terms even more significant to its overall financial success. Internationally, Men in Black 3 became the highest grossing installment in the entire Men in Black franchise, and its total international haul made it the 10th highest grossing film of 2012 on a global basis when combined with its North American total. The film's international opening weekend alone generated approximately $135.3 million across a rollout spanning 85 separate territories, a scale of simultaneous international release that reflected how central day and date or near simultaneous global rollouts had become for major studio tentpoles by this period, as opposed to the more staggered market by market release patterns that had been more common in earlier decades of the industry. Among individual international markets, the film's strongest opening weekend performances came from China, where it generated approximately $21.7 million, and from Russia and the broader Commonwealth of Independent States region, where it generated approximately $16.9 million. These figures underscore the growing commercial importance of the Chinese theatrical market, specifically to major Hollywood tentpole releases. During this period, a trend that would only continue to intensify across the following decade as Chinese box office infrastructure and movie-going audiences continued to expand rapidly. The film went on to hold the top box office position outside North America for 2 consecutive weekends, further cementing its status as one of the definitive global blockbuster successes of the 2012 release calendar. This performance is particularly notable given the competitive landscape Men in Black 3 was released into. The summer of 2012 was an unusually crowded season for major studio tentpole releases, with several other high-profile franchise films occupying the same general release window and competing for the same pool of blockbuster-going audiences, both domestically and internationally. That Men in Black 3 was able to post opening weekend numbers that exceeded both of its franchise predecessors, while also setting a new Memorial Day IMAX opening record and taking the top international box office spot for 2 consecutive weekends, indicates that the film managed to carve out a substantial share of audience attention. Despite this crowded marketplace, rather than being overshadowed by the other major releases competing for the same holiday weekend audience. The film's particularly strong performance in markets such as China and the Russia CIS region also reflected a broader shift then underway in the economics of Hollywood blockbuster filmmaking, in which international box office receipts were steadily growing to represent a larger and larger share of a major tentpole's total worldwide gross relative to North American ticket sales alone, a trend Men in Black 3's own box office breakdown illustrates clearly, given that its international total of roughly $475.2 million considerably outpaced its $179 million domestic haul. Critical response professional critical reception to Men in Black 3 skewed generally positive, though with a meaningfully more mixed undertone than its outright commercial success might suggest on the review aggregation site Rotten Tomatoes. The film held an approval rating of 67% based on a sample of 250 collected reviews with an average critic rating of 6 out of 10. The site's editorially written critical consensus summarized the overall critical sentiment as one acknowledging that the film did not necessarily make a compelling case for continuing the franchise into further sequels, while still crediting it as an improvement over its immediate predecessor and one that managed to exceed the generally modest expectations many critics carried into it. On Metacritic, a separate aggregation platform that calculates a weighted average score based on a curated selection of major critics' reviews, Men in Black 3 earned a score of 58 out of 100 based on 38 individual critic reviews, a figure that the site's own scoring rubric classifies as indicating mixed or average reviews overall, a somewhat more tempered characterization than the comparatively more favorable Rotten Tomatoes approval percentage might suggest on its own. Meanwhile, general audiences surveyed by CinemaScore on opening night awarded the film an average grade of B+, a score notable for matching the identical B+ grade earned by both of the two previous films in the franchise, suggesting a remarkable degree of consistency in how mainstream opening weekend audiences responded to all three Men in Black films, despite the considerable gap in time separating the third film's release from the second's. Individual critic reactions to the film varied considerably in both tone and emphasis, though a number of specific elements recurred across multiple reviews. Roger Ebert, writing in the Chicago Sun-Times, awarded the film 3 out of 4 stars and specifically singled out Josh Brolin's performance as the younger version of Agent K for particular praise, describing the casting choice as an excellent example of smart casting decision making. Ebert additionally praised the film's plot construction, its creature design, and its climactic sequence, characterizing the film's plotting as ingenious and its concluding stretch as a genuinely accomplished piece of filmmaking. Richard Roper, a critic who had long been publicly associated with film review programming, gave the film 3.5 out of 5 stars, framing it as a rare example of a third installment in a franchise that managed to avoid the steep quality decline so often associated with second sequels, while praising its visual effects work and noting an unexpected emotional depth to the story. A.O. Scott, writing for the New York Times, similarly awarded the film 3.5 out of 5 stars, framing his review around the observation that the film did not appear to be straining to make any particular grand statement or thematic argument, and suggesting that this comparative lack of overt ambition may have paradoxically contributed to how enjoyable the finished film ultimately was as a piece of pure entertainment. Lisa Schwartzbaum, reviewing for Entertainment Weekly, offered praise for the way Sonnenfeld and screenwriter Ethan Cohen managed to steer the franchise forward while respecting the particular creative challenges inherent to reviving a well-established, culturally dated piece of blockbuster intellectual property, suggesting that the filmmaker's approach could serve as something of a model for other filmmakers facing similar franchise revival challenges. Rafer Guzman, writing for Newsday, offered a more tempered assessment, acknowledging that the franchise's cultural standing as a top-tier blockbuster property had diminished somewhat since its 1997 debut, and that Rick Baker's celebrated creature and makeup effects work had begun to feel somewhat less novel after two prior films, while still ultimately characterizing the third installment as a pleasant, amiable comedic effort buoyed by the familiarity and chemistry of its returning cast. Beyond the professional critical establishment, the film also drew a notable reaction from at least one prominent filmmaker outside the traditional critic pool. Director Paul Thomas Anderson, known for a body of work stylistically quite distant from mainstream studio blockbuster film making, publicly praised Man in Black 3, singling out the film's time travel driven emotional beats as surprisingly affecting, describing himself as an easy target for that particular kind of emotionally driven storytelling, and indicating that those sections of the film had moved him considerably more than he might have expected going in. Not every critical response to the film was favorable, however. Rene Rodriguez, writing for the Miami Herald, delivered one of the more sharply negative assessments of the film among widely circulated reviews, awarding it just 1 out of 4 stars and characterizing the finished film as tedious and creatively hollow to a degree that made him newly grateful. For perhaps the first time in his experience as a critic, that a film happened to be showing in the 3D format, he generally found unnecessary a backhanded compliment, suggesting that the added visual dimensionality of the 3D presentation was, in his estimation, doing more work to hold his attention than the story or characters themselves were. Taken together, this range of critical response, from Eber's and Roper's genuine enthusiasm through Scott's and Schwarzbaum's more measured appreciation, to Guzman's mixed assessment and Rodriguez's outright dismissal, illustrates a critical landscape that, while net positive in aggregate, was far from unanimous in its assessment of the film's merits. The recurring through line across nearly all of these reviews, positive and negative alike, was a consistent acknowledgement of Josh Brolin's performance as the younger Agent K as one of the film's clearest and most broadly agreed upon successes, a piece of praise that stands as one of the most consistent and widely shared critical judgments to emerge from the film's overall reception. Considered against the reception of its immediate predecessor, Men in Black 3's critical standing represented a meaningful improvement for the franchise. Men in Black I, released a decade earlier in 2002, had been broadly regarded by critics as a disappointing follow-up to the beloved original, with many reviewers at the time faulting it for leaning too heavily on the visual and comedic formula of the first film without finding meaningful new territory to explore. That the third installment was so frequently described by critics, including in the Rotten Tomatoes critical consensus itself, as an improvement over the second film, suggests that the years of development difficulty, the multiple rounds of script rewrites, and the unusually improvisational nature of the production ultimately paid creative dividends that were not guaranteed given how troubled the film's path to the screen had been. At the same time, the persistent note of ambivalence found even among many of the film's positive reviews, the sense articulated in different ways by Scott Schwarzbaum and the Rotten Tomatoes consensus alike, that the film was an enjoyable but not especially essential piece of blockbuster filmmaking reflected a broader critical wariness toward legacy sequels arriving many years after a franchise's cultural peak, a wariness that would become an increasingly common feature of film criticism as more and more long dormant properties were revived for new installments throughout the following decade. In that sense, Men in Black 3's critical reception sits at an interesting midpoint, warm enough to validate the extended effort the filmmakers put into getting the story right, particularly with respect to Brolin's performance and the film's emotionally driven time travel core, yet measured enough to acknowledge that the franchise's cultural moment as a genuine pop culture phenomenon had, by 2012, largely passed.